My name is Jacob Glick. I was an investigative counsel for the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack. I currently work as policy counsel at Georgetown University Law Center's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, which is a nonprofit that does a lot of impact litigation and policy work to protect constitutional rights of all sorts. And we do a lot of work to help local officials and community members prevent political violence, including violence by unlawful private paramilitary groups. Before I worked in the Select Committee, I was a counsel for Congressman Jamie Raskin's Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, where I helped to conduct his investigation into the role of violent white supremacy in the current domestic terror landscape and the federal government's response to those threats. And before that, I worked for Congressman Raskin in his personal office and also served as a lawyer on the impeachment manager's trial team during the second impeachment of President Trump. While I was on the Select Committee, I worked on the Purple Team, which was a team kind of tasked with looking at the bigger picture of January 6th and providing some context for us to better understand the attack. So in the course of that work, my team focused primarily on domestic violent extremist groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, who were instrumental in executing and planning the attack, as well as the role of social media companies and the broader landscape of far-right extremism that sort of all coalesced leading up to the attack on the Capitol and President Trump's call to attack the Capitol.
Yeah, that's thank you for all this work that you've done in this regard. And I think one of the kind of my first question is, how did we get to January 6th? You know, that's a very simple question. Should only take you a couple of seconds to answer it. But we saw kind of the groups that you looked at. How did we get to them rushing into the Capitol? And maybe you could kind of, walk us through what you found.
Sure. So again, this is myself just kind of speaking about the evidence that I helped collect and my analysis of this evidence that the Select Committee has released in underlying transcripts and documents. And I think that story of the underlying evidence tells a really frightening and foreboding message about why we got to January 6th, because a lot of folks want to talk about January 6th as a day that went horribly wrong because President Trump was a horribly corrupt, horribly anti-democratic figure who was willing to provoke violence and call his supporters to the Capitol. All of that is true, but what we uncovered on the Select Committee is that that was the result of a much longer process of radicalization and a turn towards extremism on the far right of our political spectrum, and a willingness by organizers and political operatives in President Trump's orbit to accept help from self-proclaimed violent extremist paramilitaries like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. And a lot of this happened over the course of 2020, as there was just turbulent event after turbulent event that really shocked the country and made far-right paramilitaries feel empowered to take it upon themselves to enforce law and order. And we tried to parse through this story in our depositions with members of these groups. So I think the most important starting point that we found in our depositions was really the onset of the COVID pandemic. In March and April of 2020, a lot of large cities and municipalities across the country tried to enforce measures to restrict public gatherings and other things like that. And there were individuals in the anti-lockdown space, anti-mask space, people who were organizing and exercising their First Amendment constitutional rights to protest their governments. And in the course of that organizational push, so to speak, a lot of these individuals came into contact with far-right paramilitaries like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, who had long been waiting for a moment of sort of anti-government mobilization. And that's when they always imagined that they would step into the fore of the public arena and sort of become a paramilitary force that was able to enforce their version of law and order and enforce what they believed to be necessary and correct and morally justified. And so I think a really potent example of this is Kelly Sorrell, who has since been charged for her participation in January 6th. She was a lawyer who was a close advisor to Stewart Rhodes. And when we deposed her, she was extremely chatty, and she talked to us about how she first became entangled with the Oath Keepers because she was organizing against the lockdowns, quote unquote, in Texas. And there were protests in Texas at the state capitol where the Oath Keepers were providing security to Sorrell's group and other groups. And so Sorrell initially became entangled with the Oath Keepers when she was sort of participating in other rallies related to coronavirus measures. And you take her 9 months forward, fast forward 9 months, and Sorrell is driving with Stewart Rhodes, picking up weapons and tactical gear, as alleged by the DOJ, which they then deposit in Virginia before going to DC on January 5th. And so these people might strike us as crazy sometimes, but it's really important to understand this path towards radicalization because you have, in one woman, Kelly Sorrell, a movement towards January 6th that begins with COVID-19. But I think that the most important pivot point of how we got January 6th is really the moment over the summer of 2020 after George Floyd was murdered by police, when the groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and other militia groups really felt like the protests, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the ensuing violent counter protests was really their moment to step into the limelight. And President Trump was doing everything he could to encourage these folks implicitly and explicitly that this was also their moment to step into the limelight. You saw rhetorical patterns between the president and these groups being echoed. They were talking about standing back and standing by, which obviously came a little later during the debate. You had President Trump sort of echoing paramilitary vigilante slogans like when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And then you had on Facebook and Twitter, members of these paramilitary groups talking about being locked and loaded and ready for Civil War Part 2. That moment of unrest that came in response to the Black Lives Matter protests, which were overwhelmingly peaceful, of course, really demonstrated the deep roots of the rage of the groups that ended up participating in January 6th. So a lot of these organizations, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, are really intent on not styling themselves as sort of old guard, far-right vigilante groups. They say they're not the KKK, and it's true. I think the story is a lot more complicated, what motivates these groups, and I hope we can talk more about that. But what you saw during the summer of 2020 was that these groups believed it was their moment to step in to enforce law and order. And they believed they were doing so in alignment with President Trump's own wishes. And remember, during that summer, President Trump was talking openly about invoking the Insurrection Act, which came up a lot later on in the year. But he was first talking about that in the context of Black Lives Matter protests, basically putting down a quote unquote insurrection in response to overwhelmingly peaceful protests. And you saw President Trump take truly authoritarian measures to crack down on protest and dissent in places like Portland, Oregon, when he sent unmarked federal agents to sort of abduct protesters and hold journalists and protesters without due process. And that also happened in Washington, D.C., of course, when there was the infamous Lafayette Square showdown between protesters and federal forces. And I think that you see this move towards a more anti-democratic stance on protest, on certainly a racial justice movement in general, really sink in with people who went on to participate in January 6th. So in his deposition with us, Stewart Rhodes testified that he wanted President Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act over the summer of 2020 so that Oath Keepers could step in and detain racial justice protesters and pass them along to authorities. You basically would have a deputized, state-sanctioned militia going into our cities and picking up protesters. And that's ultimately what Stewart Rhodes hoped would happen on January 6th, too. So I think you saw these individuals and these groups really form a sort of confident worldview in the months before January 6th. And by the time you got to Stop the Steal, by the time President Trump was saying these same Democratic politicians who locked you up, who let Antifa and Black Lives Matter run wild, they are also stealing the election from me now. And they were primed for that fact pattern, and they were really ready to respond. And as soon as President Trump gave them a target in his infamous tweet on December 19th, they were ready to respond. And they responded swiftly and aggressively, as we found on the committee. And so I think that that's the sort of short version of the story of how we got January 6th. Obviously, there are decades and centuries worth of really ugly ideologies and anti-democratic movements that helped to fuel the sort of superstructure of what we saw on January 6th. But in terms of the evidence that we collected on the Select Committee, it certainly seems like this was not a single day that went very wrong. It was a months-long movement of anti-democratic forces that were confident they could take on the rule of law in our democratic republic.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. That's a great overview of the kind of, I think, how we got there. And I think one of the things that I would kind of like to back up a little bit and kind of, for people who may not know, I mean, they've probably heard all these names and Oath Keepers and Three Percenters and the Proud Boys, but what do they actually, what's their ideology if they have any, and how does it jive, or how does it kind of mesh with this radicalization that we see during the pandemic? So how do you take someone who might be like, I don't want my kid to have a vaccine, I don't want to wear a mask, to suddenly getting to violent extremism? You know, how did you find that happen?
Well, and you saw a lot of these concerns about schools and children, and in particular sort of mesh really closely with the path towards violence on January 6th. And obviously we were deposing a lot of these folks in 2022. So the issue set had changed a bit from January 2021, but it still fascinates me to sort of think through the ramifications of how this hodgepodge of issues makes sense for each group. And so I'll start with the Oath Keepers. And I think it's important to say at the outset that there are a lot of individuals who associate with many of these groups, and the threat really is the network of far-right organizations and movements that are willing to court violence or endorse violence. And we shouldn't get too caught up in the individualized definitions of each of these groups, because I think that actually serves their purpose, as I'll sort of hopefully try to explain. And so the Oath Keepers are sort of had been, until January 6th, the centerpiece of the modern anti-government militia movement. And they were founded in 2009 by Stuart Rhodes, largely as a response to President Obama's ascension to office. And they were at first focused on sort of some of the more traditional anti-government targets, which include sort of standing off with federal forces at sort of faraway rural ranches and reserves. So they had standoff with the Bureau of Land Management, things of that nature. But there was always a deeper undercurrent of, I think, conspiracy thinking and anti-Semitism that sort of shot through a lot of what the Oath Keepers was presenting to the public. And we heard testimony from Jason Van Tatenhove, former spokesman for the Oath Keepers, who then abandoned the group, who testified at one of the January 6th committee hearings, who sort of explained how a lot of the anti-government propaganda that Stuart Rhodes put out was really didn't comport with some of the ugliness he saw within the ranks of the Oath Keepers that included Holocaust denialism, racism, homophobia, things of that nature. But once President Trump was elected, you saw the Oath Keepers and Stuart Rhodes increasingly align themselves with the Trump administration, which is obviously ironic given that they were supposedly an anti-government group. And you saw them, by the time you get to 2019 and 2020, increasingly target ideological opponents on the ground that aren't government actors, but they're sort of so-called Antifa provocateurs, and others who are opposed to the Oath Keepers' general moral and political orientation, as opposed to the federal government. And obviously, it's convenient to see that shift happen when the federal government itself shifts ideological orientation. And so Stuart Rhodes' alignment with President Trump, I think, undermines a lot of the credibility of the Oath Keepers as a truly anti-government, libertarian kind of organization, because, as I mentioned earlier, Stuart Rhodes was actively agitating to become part of President Trump's sort of private militia or unofficial militia in the summer and then later in the winter after the election as an attempt to help President Trump crack down on his opponents. And that's not what the Oath Keepers would sort of typically like to style themselves as. It's not what the militia movement likes to describe themselves as. And I think you definitely had other individuals in the militia movement, more traditional sectors, some of whom we deposed, really sort of object to that overt alignment that we saw with the Oath Keepers. And the Proud Boys are an interesting case as well. They were founded as not as a sort of anti-government militia group, but as a far-right street gang that was super explicit in that in saying they were aligned with President Trump from the get-go. They were founded right as President Trump took office, and I think they're really open about being centered on ideals of Western chauvinism, as they describe it. What does that mean? In a lot of instances in our depositions, we had the opportunity to ask them sort of, what does it mean to support Western civilization? Their slogan is, West is best. And they would say a lot of things, some of which didn't make a lot of sense. Others really did recur as important themes to pull out, including sort of the focus on traditionalism, traditional gender roles, toxic masculinity, sort of if you want to give it that moniker, which includes lots of references to homophobic ideas, transphobic ideas, misogynistic ideas. And they're a lot more open about sort of being a fighting force to target the left. And that was sort of Antifa at the get-go, but it quickly evolved into Black Lives Matter, which many of them described as a sort of puppet of Antifa, which is in itself a pretty racist idea that I think gets to ideas like the Great Replacement theory that I hope we discuss later on in the conversation. And so you saw the Proud Boys be a lot more militant in their self-description than many of the more traditional militia groups. But what's important to understand in a lot of the work that we do at ICAP is combating the rise of private paramilitary groups in general, no matter what their sort of ideological self-description is, because in every state, there is some law prohibiting private paramilitary conduct. And whether it's the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys or the Three Percenters, all of these groups are not protected by the First or Second Amendment. They're not protected by any provision of the Constitution. And it's up to local law enforcement to really use tools at their disposal to combat these groups as best they can, or up to lawmakers to better fashion remedies against the rise of these groups. And so in the context of January 6th, a lot of these sort of anti-government and far-right groups came together for a specific mission of helping to keep President Trump in office. And we saw these groups sort of dismiss each other and really accentuate the divisions amongst the far-right coalition, far-right paramilitary coalition, before January 6th. So you had Oath Keepers really saying the Proud Boys were amateurish Nazis who just wanted to pick a fight. And you had the Proud Boys say the Oath Keepers were a bunch of old guys who were pretending to be soldiers. And that is a component of the Oath Keepers sort of mission. They want to recruit former law enforcement. They want to recruit military members. They use sort of the rhetoric of patriotism to attract individuals. The whole idea behind their name is that people took an oath to defend the Constitution. They should continue defending the Constitution by doing often illegal and unconstitutional things, but that's beside the point. And so they really hated each other in a lot of contexts, including the Black Lives Matter protests, for the most part, the COVID-19 protests, and certainly earlier. But once you get to President Trump calling them all to DC, you saw an unprecedented level of coordination and cooperation between these groups, including messages that we discussed in our final report, that the committee discussed in its final report, between members of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. And you also had the leaders of the two groups, Enrique Tarrio and Stuart Rhodes, speaking on the same group chats, the same encrypted group chats with figures like Roger Stone and others who were helping to plan the Stop the Steal movement. And so when these groups have common cause, whether it's Charlottesville in 2017 or January 6th, they're very often willing to set aside their differences to advance a very distinctly authoritarian and violent worldview. And that's what everyone who's listening needs to focus on, is that this threat does not end because these groups all of a sudden hate each other again after January 6th, and they're all sniping at each other and they seem disorganized, because the threat, as I said earlier, and this is attributable to one of my colleagues on the committee who said this all the time, and now I've internalized what she said, the threat is the network of individuals who want to come together for a particularized purpose. And the best way to think about this coalition is an anti-democratic, authoritarian coalition that will continue to select new targets until they have another rallying cry. And we've seen that happen throughout the country now with the targeting of LGBTQ communities, LGBTQ individuals, whether it's drag shows or LGBTQ bars. There's a real concerted effort by the Proud Boys in particular to keep this story moving forward and keep their hold on the public imagination until they can mobilize at a large national scale once again, whether that's in response to something that President Trump tells them to do or something that someone else tells them to do. They're aware of the ebb and flow of this cycle. And I don't think that there are any sort of ideological distinctions that they would sort of use to reject allies when the next large rallying cry comes. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And one of the things that kind of strikes me, and I think can be confusing, is that there's this like anti-law enforcement, pro-law enforcement kind of tension within these groups. And they, as you were speaking, it was kind of, they wanted to come in and help the police or act as de facto police or do the things the police can't do. But I think like a normal citizen who's not radicalized in any way sees the riots of or not the riots, but the protests of Black Lives Matter, and then the police riots and their response, and goes, wow, those cops are really cracking down. How do these groups see that? Or do they just see the chaos and want to jump into it?
Well, I think the simplest way to put it is they see the chaos, they want to jump into it because their entire theory of the case is that they should be the private military groups who are taking law and order into their own hands, as I've said. And we see echoes of that throughout history as various democracies are struggling with authoritarian movements. There are street gangs who try to assert themselves as legitimate sources of state power and of violence and act in alignment with their leaders to try to sort of delegitimize protests and delegitimize dissent and make it dangerous. And I think that's the most important urgent lesson to draw from how these groups perceived the Black Lives Matter protests in particular, but also the Stop the Steal moment. I think that to dive into your point a little bit more, there is certainly a sort of desire to keep this veneer of law enforcement support alive and well, especially amongst the Oath Keepers, but also the Proud Boys. When you talked about the Black Lives Matter protests, many of them claimed to us in testimony that they were motivated to join these extremist groups because they thought that the police were being threatened. Remember, there are many veterans of law enforcement and the military who end up becoming involved in these groups, although, of course, the vast majority of veterans have no affiliation whatsoever. And it's important to differentiate those two facts. But the reality is that members of the Oath Keepers often overlap with veterans of law enforcement agencies. And so, of course, it's an important part of the organizational appeal of the Oath Keepers to talk about serving law enforcement. And the Proud Boys, to a lesser extent, have the same sort of dynamic. But what happened during the Black Lives Matter protests is that there was a perceived sort of sync between the ideological goals of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and what they saw the police to be doing, which was cracking down on peaceful protests by racial justice protesters. And so you saw instances of coordination between the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the police. They were better able to say, we're just there to help support the police to sort of keep the peace. That in and of itself is not legal unless individuals are specifically deputized to help law enforcement. And in most cases, and they were not. So that's still illegal to sort of, in many states, illegal to assume the duties of law enforcement improperly. But sort of setting that aside, these groups felt like they were in alignment with the police, just like they thought they were in alignment with President Trump. But as you get towards the January 6th moment, increasingly, these individuals are no longer in alignment with police. And they are seeing the police as sort of adversaries to getting anything done. And at the end of the day, they're in pursuit of their ideological goals, and their ideological goals at that time really involved just keeping President Trump in power. And so if we think about sort of their relationship with the police, the relationship to the police is really contingent on the police's sort of ability to fulfill their own the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers' ideological agenda. And if there were still individuals who we deposed who were really offended when we started getting to sort of questions about violence against the police on January 6th, even when individuals were clearly sort of in sight of violence against police officers and other law enforcement officials, they would really recoil when we asked about that. And I think that's because the mythology of these patriot groups, these anti-government groups, even the Proud Boys, is that they are on the side of law and order. But when you dig down deep into it, law and order is what they say it is. It's not what the Constitution says it is, or what the rule of law says it is. And there was one Proud Boy in particular who we deposed, who was very chatty, again, like Kelly Sorrell. And we talked to him about this dynamic. And he basically explained that he believed that the Proud Boys served as a sort of moral police force to enforce morality when police were not able to, because they are constrained by laws, and laws are not always moral. And if you draw out that dynamic, it's really dangerous. It's really dangerous, and it's really profoundly anti-democratic, because the Proud Boys are basically presenting themselves in this telling as a force of violence that is able to supersede law enforcement, supersede civilian elected officials and their own desires expressed through lawmaking, expressed through protest. And they believe that they're alone able to enforce their view of the world, even if law enforcement is only able to enforce the law. And so over the summer of 2020, it was lucky and a happy coincidence that their view of the world was what the law enforcement community in various cities was working towards. They were working in alignment to sort of crack down on Black Lives Matter protesters. At least that's what the Proud Boys saw. But what you saw on January 6th is that their perceived goals diverged, because law enforcement was protecting the Capitol and ensuring that there was a peaceful transition of power. And the Proud Boys and other groups were determined to stop that. And there was no compunction about sort of going against law enforcement, whatever the ex post rationale might be.
Well, yeah, and I guess while you were speaking, I kept thinking of Kyle Rittenhouse. And I mean, we know that he was radicalized in some of the same forums as some of the January 6th protesters, and by some of that same rhetoric, if not the same groups. And
Yeah,
that's just one of those.
Well,
we're lucky there are not more, I suppose.
And the Kyle Rittenhouse example, I think, is it really instructive, because there was a call that went out for militias, for members to come and join a militia in Kenosha during that sort of extended protest after the shooting there. And what ensued, obviously, was violence and death, but also a lionization of that militia mobilization on the far right, both the violent far right and the sort of more traditional political parts of the far right. And that should sound every alarm bell that we have in a democracy, because you see the same thing happening, of course, with January 6th. And everyone up to and including President Trump is now treating January 6th as a moment of martyrdom. And obviously the woman who died while assaulting the speaker's lobby has become, in particular, a real martyr to the cause of the J6ers, as many folks call it, in that space. And that's a really profoundly dangerous dynamic, because we see We see an increased willingness to endorse political violence when there is the sense that your enemies are also responding to you with force. And this pattern of escalation is something we've seen across the country in recent months too. We've seen this sort of escalation when there are armed extremist groups descending on drag brunches and other LGBTQ community events. When they show up armed and they show up ready to do battle, there's a higher chance that they will clash with counter protesters who are trying to protect the LGBTQ community. And it's not illegal for anyone to act as a private paramilitary group, and everyone who is mobilizing in support of LGBTQ rights or civil rights should understand that it is in many states, in all states, illegal in some way to act as a private paramilitary group. And we should never lose sight of that truth, that we should all work to curtail political violence. But the reality is that the more these far-right groups, these armed extremists, start to interfere with civil society, the higher risk there is of escalation into more conflict. And so the endorsement of the lionization of these individuals like Kyle Rittenhouse and January 6th participants, I think only heightens the risk of a spiral of violence.
Well, yeah, I kind of want to bring up at this point kind of where we are now and so you kind of touched on a little bit, but how is the J6 being spun by these groups? What are they still as active as they were prior? Have they been disrupted by law enforcement and these convictions and prosecutions?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one striking thing that was a part of a lot of the interviews and depositions we conducted on the committee is that there was a large desire by certain members of these groups to distance themselves from these groups, given the public accountability and the shame and the legal jeopardy that was now attached to being part of the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys. And folks we interviewed were close enough to the action that they probably couldn't always say they were I don't know anything about them. They couldn't do that, but they often were trying to minimize their current association with the group. And I think that is one small measure of public accountability working, and sort of our society's shift or the ability of our society to shift away from political violence when we kind of stand up clearly and say in a bipartisan, morally clear way that violence is not acceptable, and that these groups like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys committed violence against our democracy. I think you see that cut through a lot of the mythology and a lot of the rhetoric that encouraged a lot of individuals to view these groups through rose-colored glasses, or red, white, and blue colored glasses, I should say. And so that's one measure of accountability and one measure of sort of hope, I think. But there were many individuals in these depositions who doubled down, and you kind of can go one for one. And so I don't want to paint an overly optimistic picture because I don't endorse an overly optimistic picture, unfortunately. The Oath Keepers have been, I think, less active since January 6th. And in many ways, Stuart Rhodes' prosecution and the prosecution of other Oath Keepers for seditious conspiracy, they have, of course, now been convicted of seditious conspiracy, I think probably does hamper their ability to have another large-scale militia muster, because this was really Stuart Rhodes' brainchild. And that's very clear from the testimony that we elicited, that's all public now, of course, is that this was really Stuart Rhodes' endeavor. And it was relying on his leadership, his vision, such as it was. And without him, it's unclear how they'll continue. The Proud Boys, unfortunately, I think are a totally different story. They have reevaluated their strategy in the wake of January 6th, clearly. And they were a quite an organized paramilitary force in the days and weeks leading up to the 6th. And Enrique Tarrio, in evidence that we presented to the public and that DOJ has presented to the public in the ongoing trial, he really took unprecedented steps to organize and streamline the Proud Boys into a even more even to an even more effective paramilitary group, paramilitary operation before January 6th, including a sort of new command structure that we see in traditional private paramilitary units and other sorts of communications to that effect. Obviously, that strategy has changed in the wake of January 6th, and you haven't seen a national muster by Proud Boys groups. But some of these chapters, especially in sort of the Southeast, are very active. And we've seen that their target has shifted away from sort of targeting election workers and the democratic processes themselves, but looking at local government. School boards, town councils who are dealing with policies related to the pandemic, mask policies, vaccine policies, as you mentioned at the outset, and also sort of the ongoing assault on the LGBTQ population. And you've seen the Proud Boys sort of meld their missions seamlessly into the current issues that are animating the far right today. So it's the same sort of extension of the big lie that we saw in the election season. It's this idea that there are sort of sinister elites who are trying to pervert our society into something that is not, quote unquote, Western civilization, something that is morally and ideologically perverse. And it's a pernicious, conspiratorial, toxic fixation that these Proud Boys continue to hold. And now they're taking it out on innocent members of the LGBTQ community and their allies. And we saw that was itself a shift from targeting school board members and community leaders and parents who were trying to sort of do the work of self-government at the most intimate level. And so I don't think we can expect the Proud Boys to stop their interference, their violent intimidation in our democracy anytime soon. And we've seen that their new sort of fixation on LGBTQ issues and on sort of COVID policies has now been melded fully into the broader coalition of which they aspire to be a part. So President Trump has now talked quite a lot about trans rights in a really dangerous and discriminatory way. You've seen CPAC endorse eliminationist rhetoric about trans individuals, saying that trans people should be eradicated from public life. And of course, you have people like Governor Ron DeSantis really leaning into the homophobic and transphobic ideas that are circulating in the same far-right spaces that incubated the big lie and the call to mobilization of January 6th. So I think it's important to view these threats as connected and continuous and sort of different chapters in an ongoing insurrectionary movement against sort of a more expansive American democracy. And I think the real danger of January 6th and of President Trump's conduct is that he showed, and the January 6th moment showed, that this sort of political violence in service of a retrograde political agenda can work. And that you can have that option open. You can tap into the darkness of groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers to help accomplish your political agenda. And now that pattern has been unsealed, I'm worried that we'll see it happen more and more, which is part of why at ICAP we've been really focused on trying to combat the violent behavior of paramilitary groups, because we need to get back to a space where we can have all the ideological debates we want, but we cannot allow violence to be injected into those debates. And that's unfortunately what we saw and what we continue to see.
That's a great overview of kind of where I wanted to wrap it up, where, we have these threads which are racist, sexist, anti-government, and then, it's kind of hidden behind this homophobia that can be, protect the children kind of ideology, which, we've seen, as we've been talking, radicalizes people very quickly online. But I kind of would like to kind of end on a note with, like, if somebody's feeling really hopeless about all this, what can they personally do, or what can they pay attention to, or, get involved with to kind of combat this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for all the darkness that we saw in sort of uncovering the story of January 6th on the committee, there's also a lot of hope. So for every sort of operative we uncovered who was having private messages with Stuart Rhodes and eager to welcome him into their event, for every sort of racist or anti-Semitic or misogynistic DM between Proud Boys in advance of January 6th, there were, obviously dozens of leaders across the country who stood up against political violence despite their party affiliation and refused to go along with this clear movement towards an anti-democratic polity that was more accepting of political violence and actually welcomed paramilitary vigilante activity in furtherance of political goals. And so we see a lot of people who rejected that and ultimately made January 6th a failed attempt. And that, I think, really the credit should go to nonpartisan election workers and Democrats and Republicans across the country and local election offices who refused to bow to the pressure, the violent intimidation of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and others, all the way up to President Trump, who tried to make their lives more difficult and ultimately convince them to abandon democracy. And I think the message I leave everyone with is that we continue to see people doing the same thing, making the same courageous calculation and continuing to be involved in civic life, whether that's by getting involved in a school board, by donating to local organizations to support various marginalized groups, by just being out and declaring yourself, a participant in American society, whether that's by going to a drag show and showing your support, by voting in your local election, by volunteering as an election worker. You defy the expectation and the hope of a lot of individuals who would much rather you stay home because of their threats of violence. And there are so many more Americans who reject wholesale the idea of political violence. And I think that the real value of the story of the January 6th committee is that we've now laid out all this evidence to clearly link up the big lie and President Trump's various agitations against democracy to a violent movement against our rule of law. And now we can say what we know to be true. And we have a new civic language to discuss violence and where it can be found in our system and how we must reject it, regardless of whether we're a Democrat or a Republican or something in between. And so I think that just really should underline the value of participation in civic life. And whatever that means to everyone watching, they should just redouble their efforts to be involved in their communities and our country, because ultimately, actors like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers can only win if everyone else goes home, and if everyone else sort of decides to accept their interference, their intimidation as the new normal. And what I think we've shown after January 6th, and certainly the midterm elections and the rejection of extremist-aligned candidates who supported the big lie, shows that Americans don't want this to be the new normal, no matter what people at the top of the ticket may say. So let's just continue to reject this trend, and I think eventually we'll wear it down and we'll get to the other side of it.
Well, thank you for all your work and your time and attention today. And it was a great undertaking you were a part of, and I understand it was probably a lot of.
Thank you. Thank you, and I think that the work that you're doing here to help educate folks about the structural issues that underlie some of the trends we're seeing is really an essential part of this work of civic participation, because the way that authoritarian forces will win is by having us forget history and forget what these movements, what these extremist groups really stand for. We see that, in efforts in various states to ban books and to restrict access to sort of education about these critical issues. And so thank you for making sure more people know what we are dealing with and how we can understand the moment we're in.